All right, that should be it. So welcome everybody to the Clear Plan and Clinical Reasoning Track orientation for the Finnish Health Data Hackathon. And of course, we start by giving thanks to the sponsors of the event who make it possible. So the agenda for the event or this webinar is that first I'll go over what the Finnish Health Data Hackathon is in general. That's just a quick overview of it. Then I'll give the room to my co-lead, Adam, to go over the scope of this track in specific. And then some of the example topics that we've prepared for the tracks. Of course, there are other topics that can still be introduced, and we'll go over the ideas that you may have, whether you are here present for the webinar or whether you're watching the recording. There's ways for you to introduce your own ideas and topics for the track. And we'll end it off with a Q&A. Of course, I'll introduce myself. I'm Joonatan Vuorinen from the Duodecim Publishing Company, which is the publishing arm of the Finnish Medical Society Duodecim. We're involved in pretty much everything that has to do with clinical reasoning. So that's why we're here. And as I said, I'm co-leading this track with Adam, who'll introduce himself in a short moment. So the Nordic Health Data Hackathons is a series of hackathons across the Nordics. There's already been a couple, I can't recall exactly, but the one we're talking about now is the Finnish edition, which will take place in January. And you can go to the QR code or the linked website to find out more about it. It'll be, how should I say it? There will be quite a few different events taking place at the same time as this hackathon. So it's not like you are only, or if you want to attend in person, it's not like you're only attending this hackathon. There's plenty more to do. One of those is the 30-year symposium of HL7 Finland, which is going to be on the Monday at the same premises, but of course it requires a different registration. The biggest thing is definitely the Radical Health Festival Helsinki, which is a conference taking place in Helsinki at the same time. And the Lääkäripäivät or the Doctor Days in Helsinki also takes place, not on the exact same days, but on the same week. One thing to note here is that the other events are going to be in English, but Lääkäripäivät is in Finnish pretty much exclusively. So that's something to note. So the hackathon itself is going to be taking place on Monday, the 19th of January, starting at 9 a.m. for the Finnish time, I think this is. We have the same little typo here. It's not going to be summertime, so disregard the S there. And some of the tracks will be continuing on the Tuesday as well, depending on whether or not you could attend the whole day on Monday or not. And then presenting the results on Wednesday, the following day. Please do register in advance, but no costs are involved, well, aside from traveling to Finland and staying there. There is a registration form which you can use to register for the hackathon. Please do so in advance. It'll have some fields for you to fill, like a form usually does. Let's see. Oh, that was too far. So now's the time for me to give the floor to Adam to go over the overview of the technical scope and the sort of things that you can expect to find in this track. So please, Adam, if you can share.
Thank you, Jonathan. My name is Adam Kuver. I'm from Norway, the Norwegian Pharmaceutical Product Compendium, Felleskatalogen, where we have just recently started working on clinical decision support, and my interest for the track comes from here. So I hope you see the slides shared now. I wanted to present a few foundational technologies and implementation guides to bring everyone to the same level and to give you a sort of a reading list for the Christmas holiday in case you are not familiar with some of these technologies. So first, what the scope for the hackathon is. It's the clinical reasoning module of FHIR. If we go to the FHIR documentation, hl7.org/FHIR, there we see the table or diagram that is on the right side of the slide, and all the way at the bottom, after all the foundational technologies and simpler administrative and clinical resources, we find links to the clinical reasoning module. So the scope of that module is what we will be using at the hackathon. It includes libraries for or resources for representing clinical knowledge, like the library, plan definition, activity definition, and so on. So these are the resources that we will focus on at the hackathon. The scope of this clinical reasoning module is knowledge artifacts, and they have two main use cases, sharing and evaluation. So if we start with sharing, we can say that the goal of clinical artifacts is to represent clinical knowledge that is patient independent. So these are generic guidelines, decision support rules, and so on. And the purpose of storing them in FHIR format is to be able to share them in a standard format between different systems and even different organizations that all understand the same structures and the same standard. When it comes to evaluation, the purpose here is to take the patient-independent clinical knowledge and apply it to a context. And this context can be either a patient, a single patient, or a population, a group of patients. And this evaluation is enabled by the dynamic capabilities that are expressed through different expression languages that are coded in the resources. So they can be SQL queries or FHIRPath queries that then react to the data that is read from the populations or the patient's resources. And the results can be dynamic in a way that certain fields of the FHIR resources are set as a result of calculations. And if we have a set of suggestions and recommended actions, then these can be filtered to the actions that apply to one patient or one context. Since we will be talking about some implementation guides, I thought it was useful to include this image from the CPG on FHIR implementation guides. It helps to explain how the different types of implementation guides relate to each other and what their role is in clinical reasoning. So at the bottom left of the image, we see the foundational technologies that are part of the core FHIR specification. So the foundational technologies and like XML and JSON, the conformance resources, like the value sets and code systems, structure definitions, and also the administrative clinical resources that build on these. And at the top, or as we have seen in the diagram on one of the first slides, at the bottom, the level 5 clinical reasoning modules. So all of these with the darkish blue background, they are part of the core FHIR specification. And then we have other related HL7 standards that are related to FHIR, but not part of FHIR, like CQL and CDS hooks. And these are also often used in clinical reasoning and decision support. One level up, if we look at the model IGs, these are implementation guides that define how certain topics should be expressed with FHIR. So thinking about the patient resource, from the core specification and all the observation and medication data that is linked to the patient. That is extended in a way by the IPS implementation guide, which shows how to use these resources and how to combine them to deliver a patient summary. And then to the right of these, the different use case specific implementation guides like SDC and CPG on Fire. They define how clinical knowledge and knowledge artifacts can be expressed using Fire resources. And the top level, again, with a bluish background, these are called content implementation guides. So these build on the previous level specification IGs and express specific guidelines. So as decision support authors, we are most likely going to create content implementation guides, which store the clinical recommendations or decision support rules that we want to publish and share with consumers. So taking the first implementation guides that we are likely going to use in the hackathon, it's the CRMI implementation guide, the Canonical Resource Management Infrastructure implementation guide. It is mostly concerned with the publishing and the content management life cycle of canonical resources. So these are building blocks that are used in expressing clinical guidelines, typically value sets and code systems, care plans, and decision support rules. And the implementation guide defines several profiles for these resources, which concern specific aspects of these resources. I've listed a few of these profiles and their purpose on this slide. So for example, the shareable profile defines what kind of properties these resources must have so that they are meaningfully shareable between different systems. Publishable is similar to that. It defines what metadata has to be in the resources to be published and to be meaningfully consumed from the place it is published to by other systems. So, for example, for a resource to be published, we need to know its identity, and we have to know who is publishing it and what kind of copyright restrictions and licenses apply to the resource. The two other properties, computable and executable, are concerned with properties in using the resources. They are similar, but slightly different, since computable focuses on authoring and design time, while executable is mostly concerned with runtime and actual clinical implementation of these resources. So since there are different properties of resources, computable and executable mean different things for the different resources, while the other properties about the metadata are more shared between the different resource type. So for computable, I have included two examples, what value set and the library, what it means if these resources are computable. So a value set, for example, can have two types of definition, an intentional definition, and also a definition where all of the elements are listed. So for a value set to be computable, we need the intentional definition, which is the algorithm for computing the members of the value set. And for the library resource that usually contains clinical logic, it has to be compiled into ELM. So we have to know the CQL compiler options, for example, and different codes that are necessary for the compilation. Otherwise, we cannot compute what the end result of the library is. In a similar way, these resources, when they satisfy the executable profile, it has different meanings for that. So for example, the value set, the expansion has to be present to be executable because that allows the value set to be used in runtime environments that do not have terminology servers, so that systems that do not understand the intentional definition. And similarly, for a library to be executable, we have to know the dependencies that we need for the execution, and also the parameters and other data that we have to supply at runtime as inputs to the libraries. Moving on to the next implementation guide, CPG, the Clinical Practice Guidelines Implementation Guide. It is concerned with the methodology for encoding narrative guidelines into computable format. And the focus here is on best practices for creating computable guidelines that are a faithful representation of the intent of the narrative guidelines. And just as for the previous implementation guide, the link to the latest version is included in the slide for your reference. One key takeaway from the CPG-IG is this list of knowledge representation levels. L1 at the top is the usual clinical guidelines as it is published on a website, mostly in written form for human consumption. And the goal in the first run is the L3 structured representation that is a computable format in a FHIR format. And also using other HL7 standards like CQL. And once we have this representation, we can load it into a compatible system and end up with an L4 representation, which is then a running clinical decision support service. So a likely exercise for the hackathon is to take a level 1 guideline and see how we can transform it to level 3 representation. I've included an example for the World Anti-Doping Association. Publishes guidelines about what drugs and what substances are forbidden for athletes. And the screenshots show the narrative guideline as it is published at the website of the Norwegian affiliate. So it's a description of the substances being forbidden and also a bullet list of the different substances that the guideline applies to. As a proof of concept representation, we can look at the implementation. On the slides, we have here a value set on the left side with green background that represents the different substances, not only as text, but also with codes from a national drug master data database. And on the right side, the CQL logic that calculates the substance ingredients of certain medications, evaluates them against the value sets that represent the different groups of forbidden substances and creates issues that tell the user if taking the drug is allowed or not allowed for an athlete. And a reference to the full implementation is on the URL on the bottom of the slide that you can also check out in preparation for the hackathon. So this content is published in a content implementation guide. It is level 3, and to bring it to level 4, the steps we need to do is to take a compatible FHIR server like the HappyFHIR starter and upload all of the resources of the implementation guide. Upload also medication master data that we generate from publicly available database that we have in Norway and Finland as well. Important to match the terminology in the drug database to the content implementation guide. So for example, if the content IG is made with Norwegian substance codes, then these have to be extended with Finnish codes to be able to handle Finnish drugs. And then once the system is running, we have to send a request to the main libraries evaluate operation with user input to get a response. And such a response is shown on this slide. So what is returned from this particular level 4 implementation is a detected issue that informs the user that a certain drug because of a certain substance is forbidden. And also this issue implicates one of the resources, which is also included as a parameter. And most likely this medication resource at the bottom, it comes from the input. So that way the system can connect the query to the actual result from the decision support service. Another implementation guide that I will not spend too much time on because I don't know it very well is the evidence-based medicine EBM on FHIR implementation guide. It is also related to clinical reasoning, and a main objective is to represent scientific knowledge and research articles and research studies in FHIR format, and to share information about these in a standard format. The use cases can be to take a population, for example, the patient register of an EHR, and just check which patients are eligible to participate in a clinical study. Or it can potentially also be used to find patients or research that is relevant to a certain patient that is the subject of a query. So investigating this implementation guide and finding use cases for that can be another topic in case of interest on the hackathon. The next standard that we can look at in the implementation is CDS hooks. It is an HL7 standard in addition to FHIR, and it focuses on workflow-based decision support. On the bottom of the slide with the blue boxes, I sketched a standard medical workflow with the different steps of the patient booking an appointment, showing up for the appointment, and then the doctor making a diagnosis and prescribing medicines. And these are all individual steps in the workflow, and CDS hooks can define decision support for each of these steps. And there is where the name hook comes from, that the decision support is tied into specific places in the workflow. And of course, for this to work, both the client and the decision support service have to have a shared understanding of what the workflow steps are, where decision support is relevant. The standard defines a number of APIs. One of them is the discovery endpoint. An example is shown in the code block on this slide. This is where the decision support service announces and advertises its services or its methods, and the different hooks where it can offer decision support, along with a human readable description of what the service is, what it does, and what kind of data it requires to do to evaluate if decision support can be given at that point. Then we have the request endpoint that is sent to an individual method or CDS hooks service. And this request is also defined in the CDS hooks specification as a JSON structure. The user has to define which service to call, which hook, so which step at the workflow the user is at, and the unique ID for the invocation. And patient-specific data has to be specified or supplied as well, either in the form of access to the EHR's FHIR server or as prefetch, which is sort of pre-fetching EHR or patient data from the EHR and attaching to the service request, which can increase performance of the evaluation, because then the CDS hooks service doesn't have to look into the FHIR server and fetch the data for itself. And of course, based on the workflow, there are also hook-specific context variables, like when decision support is given at the order select stage, then there is some medication that the doctor is thinking about giving the patient, and that is also sent as part of the hook context. The response is also a predefined JSON structure. It's centered around the concept of a card, which may or may not be a pop-up window on the screen of the physician. It has textual description of the issue and also has reference to sources of the recommendation and possibility to give structured suggestions, which can contain actions that are also represented as technical actions, like storing a detected issue resource in the HR database, or updating a medication request resource if, for example, the dosage has to be adjusted. And it is a one-time interaction between client and server, but the CDS hook specification also supports structured feedback on why the recommendation was either accepted or overridden by the physician. As I mentioned, there are different hooks, and the CDS hooks specification has a hook library, so predefined steps in the clinician workflow. It is next to the CDS hook specification, but not part of it, so that hooks can be added and modified faster than the core specification. The different hooks have very different maturity levels, but the most popular ones are the patient view, so opening the patient's record, order select, and order sign, which are either prescribing medication or ordering laboratory test, for example. The last standard that I would like to talk about is probably the most complex. It is the clinical quality language, which is a query language on FHIR data. It's a custom domain-specific language developed by HL7 to represent clinical decision support rules and quality measures. It is used in FHIR. We will most likely use it with FHIR, but it is not tied to FHIR. It can be used with other data models as well. Popular server implementations like HappyFire and FireLee can both be used to run CQL code embedded in library FHIR resources. So that makes testing at a hackathon, for example, easier. If one wants to start with CQL, the link to the specification is on the slide. And also I recommend installing VS Code and the plugin that comes with it for running and evaluating CQL in development inside VS Code. And it is important to check and follow the user guide because the directory structure and the naming conventions are important to follow. Otherwise, the plugin is not going to find the test data or the library to run. Lastly, an example of how CQL looks like, hopefully to explain that one doesn't have to be scared of it. The top right is the CQL code itself that prints a standard or fixed message in the hello world variable, and on the medication, it runs a simple query listing medication request resources, filtering them to the active and displaying the codes from them. So at the bottom right of the screen, the output of the CQL plugin when the code is evaluated is shown. So we see that the hello world text matches the definition in the code, and also the medications give one string, so one code, because we see that we have an active and draft medication request in the examples. So these are all the building blocks, the technologies that we will likely use at the Connectathon. I hope you can make yourself familiar with them if some of them were new. And with that, I give the word back to Jonathan.
Thank
Stop
you
sharing.
very much. Let's see if I can find my presentation. This should be it. All right, so now that we've gone over the building blocks and the implementation guides that are relevant, I'll just fly quickly over the sort of example topics that I wrote up. There's more details about each of these on the hackathon page, and specifically the sub page for this track, which is the care plans and clinical reasoning. And for each of the example topics, Duodecim has something practical prepared for the hackathon itself, and we'll go over those things next. So first, the authoring, publishing, and sharing clinical knowledge, which is about CRMI. So one practical thing that we have worked on this year is that we have plenty of articles in different kinds of handbooks and various kinds of resources for doctors around the sort of clinical ecosystem, let's say. And most of these have some sort of implied inclusion criteria that defines what kind of patient or what kind of situation this thing is intended for. For example, this is one for acute care in terms of, well, in the situation of I can't really translate this. Anyway, it's for a specific kind of acute care. And given this kind of inclusion criteria, that could be modeled in CRMI as an actual group, as an actual like group of patient that has the characteristics that match that article. So we could have, for example, a structured way and a knowledge base that has these sort of links and definitions. You could think of that as being the sort of square one for getting towards actual structured care plans or clinical practice guidelines. So this has been our sort of initial like dipping our toe into the world of having more structure around the articles that we've already had for like a couple decades. Another example that we are going to have present at the hackathon is our medication knowledge bases. We have plenty of different kinds of resources and well, articles around various kinds of substances, for example, drug-drug interactions. There's some pharmacogenetics, various kinds of alerts and warnings that have to do with drug substances. And one thing that has been very interesting for us in practice with CRMI is the clinical use definition resource type. And we've done quite a bit of work with that in the past, which is a way of taking these articles that we have from the sort of proprietary format that they use and moving that towards something that's standard. And I don't think that I need to sell the idea to you too much, but having this kind of clinical knowledge in a format that's interoperable and in a way that can play nice with knowledge from different sources and that can be like cross-referenced across the board makes a lot of sense. So that's one very practical thing that you can do with CRMI. One thing that I want to note though is that because this CRMI and the idea of representing knowledge-based infinite resources, so that you don't have the patient resources, but you also have this sort of, as Adam said, patient-independent knowledge represented through FHIR. That's quite new still, and you can definitely see it in the tooling. So, for example, the IG publisher, well, there's in the name, but even tools like FHIR Shorthand and the Sushi compiler for that, or the unshorthander, I guess, are very much geared towards implementation guides. And I just gave an example from our interaction catalog, which has some 20,000 instances of clinical use definitions that took easily over 7 hours to run through. So there's quite a bit of work we could do around the tooling with regards to the CRMI IG, and that would benefit everyone, I think. Another big topic is defining clinical concepts, and this is core for any sort of clinical knowledge that we have. There are so many different ways of and different ontologies for like describing a drug or a substance or a condition or of some sort. One way of getting there would be to have some sort of consensus across the board, for example, in the EU, that everybody will use SNOMED CT for this and ATC for that and things like that. But that's not very flexible in reality. So one thing that, and for example, at Duodecim for our clinical decision support, we have some 1,600 different concepts that we are maintaining currently as code lists. And interesting things that could be fun to look at during the hackathon are, for example, the values that compose language, or VCL, which is a new thing in FHIR terminology that looks to be a more sort of declarative way of defining things. So, for example, I've given a couple examples. One is for a measurement that's using a Loink hierarchy. One is defining any sort of drug that uses or that has the ingredient of aspirin. One is also a drug. It's defining any sort of drug that can be classified as a nitrate, which is defined through ATC. And then there's a concept from SNOMED CT around asthma, which is a condition. So that's just one sort of example of defining a clinical concept through terminology. That gets us to a place where if you are defining something, let's say a drug, as a classification through ATC, then okay, maybe your terminology server only knows ATC or will check against ATC. So another thing that we've been working on or investigating is these sort of implicit relationships or mappings between various kinds of code systems. And this is just an example output using the Odyssey vocabularies that's known from the OMOP sphere of things. Athena is a very nice way of browsing and searching the concepts and codes they have. And from that export, I'm just looking at the example from the previous slide about drugs that have aspirin as an ingredient. There's various kinds of mappings to RxNorm and SNOMED and ATC and things like that. So that's definitely something that Duodecim is very interested in, and I think is very central concern for anybody who's dealing with clinical knowledge. And it's not just terminology. There's also ways of defining concepts that are like more broad. We already looked at the inclusion criterion that we had for a particular kind of article, for example, within the material that Duodecim has. But I think even more broadly, the idea that the EBM on Fire, or the evidence-based medicine implementation guide, has had for using various kinds of inclusion criteria and these kind of cohort definitions that are built on the group resource type is a very interesting idea. And there's plenty of examples, for example, that this slide is linking to, that you could check out, that have various quite complex even sorts of clinical concepts defined in a completely structured way. I think that's could be an interesting thing to look at. And we have already had some sort of initial discussions and proposals around how that could be used even across the different kinds of implementation guides. So not just EBM, but also in CPG and even further on, because one sort of red thread that I'm trying to point out here is that it would make a lot of sense to be able to share the clinical concepts that we use in the different sort of corners of the clinical world, instead of every single implementation guide having their own way of defining things. And that's something that Duodecim would be very, very fond of working towards. Another thing, care plans and computable guidelines. That's a very big and work-intensive topic. Something that Duodecim has done already a couple of years ago is we've taken one of our guidelines, evidence-based medicine guideline, or EBMG guideline for rheumatoid arthritis, and we've taken just a couple of the individual recommendations that we've had for the safety monitoring tests of a couple of different drugs, and in collaboration with Recent Healthcare and Firely, we have published those as L4 resources, and those are available at the link if you want to look at them. Of course, we could make more, but one thing that's been quite a, let's say, that's been a hindrance, or something that has at least slowed us and our movement towards CPG, has been the lack of public examples. So maybe we could work towards making more public examples in the hackathon. And of course, I have to mention there's currently ongoing an X-Share initiative around computable care guidelines in the EU, and that's likely going to be joining, or it is in many different ways it's related to EHDS. And as you can see, there's plenty of different kinds of actors. So it's not just about computable care guidelines, but there's also care plans and various kinds of different parts of this kind of ecosystem. I don't think that anybody can tackle this alone, but for example, Duodecim can provide some guidelines, and we can serve those kinds of or play the role of those kinds of actors. And if you happen to have an interest in joining us in working towards some of these different use cases and actors, then that would be definitely fun to take a look at. But I think that, for example, getting to a place where Duodecim could, for example, publish our entire recommendations from Käypähoito as something that's completely compatible with these models, that's still years off. Another thing is European synthetic data. Synthetic data is very important whenever you want to test some clinical content that you have. And much of the existing synthetic data has been very US-centric. I think that most likely you already know Cynthia, which is the tool that mostly everybody uses for generating synthetic data. There's also a European counterpart being developed by HL7 Europe currently, called Cinderai, which is focused on the EHDS profiles, and that's, I think, good to know. There are two main things that it contains currently. One is the European Patient Summary, which is a document which contains various different kinds of resource types within it that I have outlined here with the yellow highlights. And another is the European Laboratory Report, which, once again, it contains within it a bunch of observations within the single lab report. I've written a little extractor that can take those resource types out of the documents and make them into an ND-JSON, into an ND-JSON format that you can import, bulk import into a file server. The link is on the slide. And here I'm just sharing a couple screenshots on how that thing looks like when you import it, for example, to 8box. There's plenty of different kinds of resources that you can use already. One thing to note, these are the medication statements, and you see a lot of scary red exclamation marks on the left there. That's because there's still quite a bit of data quality issues and validation errors that those synthetic data contains. So I think one more practical thing that we could do is improve the Cinderai output. I've already opened and closed quite a bit of issues on the repository, but we could definitely use more help there so that we can get actual good EHDS compatible synthetic data for everybody to test on in the EU instead of everybody working on their own solutions. And I think this is definitely the right move for that. And lastly, implementing clinical knowledge. Duodecim will have two different kinds of integrations or mechanisms that we can demonstrate and work with you. Of course, I think that integrations are a thing that if that's going to be a topic that you're interested in the hackathon, then of course finding somebody to actually integrate with is going to be the interesting thing. Of course, the synthetic data that we just look at, that's one way of doing things, but having an actual integration is going to be much more interesting. Anyway, so Duodecim will provide a set of the medication knowledge base that we have through CRMI as clinical use definition resources, if that's something you want to play with. And the same material we can also provide through a CDS hook service that can be attached to the order select hook. Those are our examples for that. And one more thing that could be interesting, I know that Duodecim has had a non-standard hook for quite a while now, which is the questionnaire complete hook or completed hook, which Finns may know from Omaolo. It's the mechanism that is used in the backend there to take the filled questionnaire and then performing the actual symptom check based on the answers that have been given. So if there's interest, then we could take the first steps in formalizing that and putting that into the actual CDS hooks catalog, which could be useful if there are other people who are also doing things with questionnaires. So that's that quick run through. Let's move on back to the main presentation and your ideas of topics. Just a second as I set up the different presentation. Here we go. All right, so time for your ideas for topics. There is a Google Sheet. The link is on the slide, and the link is also going to be after this webinar shared in the track page. Please do share your ideas and interests. That's definitely something that we need. The things that we just looked at were very obviously from the lens of Duodecim. So please share whatever you want to be working on within the hackathon. It's going to be the actual Google Sheet is going well. It contains a couple different sheets, worksheets. So please enter your organization and the contact that's going to be like who's interested in being in contact with others. You can list some of the products that are going to be involved and your goals for the hackathon, as well as other notes. So what you're interested in doing. If you have any presentations that you want to hold, there's another sheet for those, and then ideas for tracks. So nothing is set in stone. You don't have to use the example topics that we had, but those were just to give you a sort of, or spark some discussion or ideas on the kinds of things that we could do in the hackathon. All right, time for the Q&A for the people who are here present at the webinar. Do you have anything that came to mind during these long presentations that me and Adam gave you?
I can start.
Go ahead.
Yes.
So Mikael Lindberg from Sensor Trend. Our initial interest on this track is really care plans. So we make care plans for diabetes. We take the established best practices, treatment protocols, and formalize those into an app that the patient then can see, and they can see in a formalized way, okay, this is the treatment that you should be getting, and then they can monitor whether they are actually getting that, and then kind of get more empowered towards their healthcare and saying, hey, I should be entitled to this care. And it also works the other way around. It gives healthcare organizations a structured view of who's perhaps not getting the treatment that they should be getting, kind of highlighting any treatment gaps. And so far, we've been doing this on our own, but as you, Jonathan, said quite a few times, there are many things in this realm that nobody can do on their own. So we are really looking forward to collaborating with other people on this. And as you mentioned, taking some established set of guidelines of practices and transforming that into a computable care guideline is a massive undertaking, but we'd like to take some small piece of that and get more understanding on how to do that. And as you mentioned, there are now not too many publicly available examples, so we could at least try to get our heads together and see, hey, this is how we interpret their resources, this is how we think that this should be implemented, and then publish that and ask for feedback. So
Absolutely.
that's our main interest. Then synthetic data is also somewhat of an interest. I don't think we'd be doing a lot of that, but certainly be interested in following what others do and learning from the results and what kind of data would be made available. And also have tried Cynthia and Cinderai, and currently the results are, as you mentioned, you get some data, but it doesn't validate or it's not that good quality. So that has been a barrier for us, and we'd love to see what we can do to advance the field there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mikael. Do you want to continue, Mikko?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Sounds really interesting. This is the first time that we at Forsante are with this kind of a hackathon, and we are really looking forward to collaboration within that. So what we are doing, we have this logic-based AI clinical decision support system, which provides guideline-compliant, trustworthy, and explainable decision support, and we are now looking forward to integrating that using the CDS hooks standard in this hackathon. So if there is anything you would like to try out in that context, we are very willing to explore it. And one question here is when I'm trying to kind of find out the possible collaborations, the question is to know what the other parties are kind of expecting or able to understand, because the FHIR specification and CDS hook specification, they are really vast, and it's very probable that not all parties have the whole specs kind of covered. So I'm just asking for some practical pointers. How should we approach this integration problem?
Right, great question. I think that the right place for that would be the Google Sheet that's going to be shared after this webinar. It's in this presentation, and it's going to be on the track subsite on the hackathon site itself. So in that, when you are filling out the information for Forsante and the things that you're going to be like expecting from the hackathon, there's the column for your goals and notes. I think either of those would work. So if you have some particular things that you are like that you want to use as a sort of constraints, for example, the different bits and pieces that you're interested in, or the different things that you would need your like counterpart to be able to support, for example. And I think it would make sense to fill those out. And hopefully when we get many different interested parties added to that Google Sheet, then you could look at the other people who are going to be present at the hackathon at this track, and then find the kinds of people or the kinds of organizations who have something that's compatible. That's my hope, at least.
Thanks.
Or if you find something that's not compatible, then use the hackathon as an opportunity to make them compatible.
That too. All right, anybody else?
For example, in this case, you could set up prefetch templates that define, for example, the codes that you expect the HR to send as FHIR data.
Oh yeah. I think that's
so
an
if
interesting...
you find the HR clients to test with.
Yeah, just a quick note on that. We have some experience with Dödakim already in that field, because CDS hooks is one of these things that lets you work with clients or EHRs that do not support FHIR at all, because it's just a way of receiving data. So they don't necessarily have to have a FHIR server that they give you access to, but instead they could, as Adam said, they could just provide the data to you through prefetching, which is just a post request. Go ahead, Mikael.
Yeah, about CDS hooks, Apotti will be there. That's an Epic installation in Finland. And they will have some people present helping people mainly on the patient access track, but I guess you can harass them and ask, hey, we want to test some CDS hook stuff and see what happens.
And we know for a fact that they do have ways of getting that working. We have already made a proof of concept. So you have some ammunition to go harassing them. One more thing to mention about the integrations. There is the second track, please help me, Mika, with its name, but there is a dedicated topic in there for the Finnish Smart and FHIR app launch. So if that's something that you're specifically interested in with integrations, then it might make more sense to look at that.
Yep, correct. So the other track is patient access. So how patients get access to their own data. And there are 5 topics, I guess. One is the Finnish Smart App Launch IG. That's basically just how we in Finland constrain the Smart App Launch implementation guide. And the Danes, for instance, have adopted that, and we are discussing some Nordic collaboration on that IG. And then there's I think the biggest track so far is by City of Helsinki and Apotti, where Epic is involved, and they are looking for many different kind of examples of what kind of apps can be integrated with MISA, the patient app, the patient portal that they're having. And then we have other topics. We have the digital identity wallets and national contact points. So this whole European cross-border infrastructure. And we have Kanta, the Finnish national central repository for healthcare and social care data. And they also have patient-facing API, so plenty of these. And then XShare that we mentioned, they do have the yellow button. So again, how you as a patient get access to your own data and be able to share it easily. And as mentioned, XShare will be on this care plan track as well with their clinical computable care guideline initiative.
Thank you. Great. Once more, thanks to the sponsors. We're already over time. Sorry for that. That tends to happen. And there's one more webinar with regards to the Nordic Health Hackathon or Nordic Health Data Hackathon. That's going to be tomorrow on the Friday, 19th of December, and that's going to be about the national contact points or the wallets. So if that interests you, please go and see that, or of course the webinar recordings afterwards. Thanks for participating, and sorry for going over the schedule, but that happens.